Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. Charleston exuded the history and charm of the Deep South, a unique blend of colonial architecture, cobblestone streets, and large, ancient oak trees whose branches seemed to watch over the city. Every year, in the dead of winter, high society would gather for the Winter Gala, a charity ball that became as unmissable as it was mysterious, where wealth and power were displayed in games of appearances and pretense. The chosen residence for the evening was the former Vanderbilt residence, transformed into a sumptuous reception hall. The solid oak floors reflected the soft light of the crystal chandeliers, while the walls, adorned with gilded moldings, seemed to whisper the secrets of past generations. Elegantly decorated Venetian masks hid faces, as if to remind us that, in this world of privilege, no one truly wanted to show themselves as they were. Liveried waiters roamed the room, carrying trays laden with flutes of vintage champagne and delicate petit fours, while guests exchanged pleasantries and meaningful glances. Conversations ranged from business plans to rumors of marriage alliances, against a backdrop of classical music and hushed whispers. At the center of this hushed scene, Richard Langford made his entrance. A respected, or feared, depending on your circles, businessman, Richard embodied American success. His 52 years gave him an air of quiet power, reinforced by a perfectly tailored suit, a confident smile, and a penetrating gaze. As the chairman of an influential investment fund, he knew how to play with numbers as well as egos. That night, he didn't come alone. On Richard's arm, Samantha Greer, his lover of nearly a year, shone in the spotlight. Samantha was 28, a blend of sophistication and ambition, aware of her charm and power. Her emerald dress shimmered in the light. Her sculpted heels gave her a feline gait, and her lips, painted a bold crimson, contrasted with the paleness of her skin. Yet, despite her staged beauty, her eyes were searching for something else. Or rather, someone. Because Samantha knew this evening would be more than just a display of wealth. It was a game of chess. Across the room, his gaze fell on Julian Carter. Julian, 33, was a man who didn't go unnoticed, yet preferred to keep a low profile. A consultant for several major corporations, he had the kind of quiet charm that attracted people effortlessly. His impeccably styled black hair, perfectly tailored suit, and enigmatic smile made him a valuable asset in the circles he moved. Yet behind this polished facade lurked a troubled past filled with risky decisions and carefully guarded secrets. Ironically, Richard himself had introduced Julian to Samantha at a private dinner a few months earlier, a gesture he thought was innocuous, a mere extension of his business network. Since then, Julian and Samantha had formed a secret relationship, both passionate and calculated, filled with stolen dates and coded messages. But what Richard didn't know was that Julian hadn't met Samantha by chance. Long before that, Julian had crossed paths with Evelyn Langford, Richard's wife. Evelyn, 45, a brilliant and respected lawyer known for her commitment to civil rights, had a reputation for integrity and unyielding integrity. Her career in Washington often placed her in the spotlight, but her marriage to Richard was, in the eyes of the world, an example of stability and balance. Yet Evelyn and Julian had met several months before the dinner at the Langfords, at a legal conference in New York. Their encounter had been fortuitous, but their conversations, deep and sincere, had quickly developed into a furrow of intimacy. Julian, a seducer, was different with Evelyn, less superficial, more attentive. What had begun as an intellectual complicity had evolved into a discreet affair. Thus, without knowing it, Richard Langford had placed in his inner circle the man who seduced both his wife and his mistress. Julian, with his hidden motives, was playing both sides. When Richard saw Evelyn in the crowd, he thought, for a moment, that her eyes betrayed him. She wasn't in Washington. She wasn't traveling to a civil rights conference, as she'd assured him. No, she was here, in the very heart of his kingdom. And she wasn't alone. She was radiant. Her figure, statuesque in a black velvet gown with a discreet but fatal neckline, stood tall, dignified, surrounded by light like a queen returning to her throne. She wore a finely crafted golden mask, but Richard would have recognized her eyes among 1,000. Those eyes never trembled. And that evening, They seemed to dance, serene, almost amused. But it wasn't just his presence that chilled Richard. It was the man at her side, the one who placed a light, intimate hand on the small of her back. This gesture was not trivial. It was possessive, protective, a gesture Richard knew too well to ignore its meaning. Julian Carter. Richard felt an invisible blade pierce his chest. Sweat slowly beaded at his temple, despite the cool, air-conditioned room. His mind, usually calculating and precise, wavered. The faces around him blurred, the hubbub faded, replaced by the dull thud of his own heart beating too fast. Everything he thought he controlled was slipping away. Samantha, who had been at his side a few seconds earlier, now stood back, frozen in her green dress. Her parted lips betrayed a mixture of shock and humiliation. Her eyes moved from Julian to Evelyn, then to Richard. She understood. She understood everything. She wasn't the only one. She wasn't even the favorite. Richard stepped forward, as if holding his breath, into the gilded crowd. Each step sounded hollow. The marble of the hall, once a symbol of his social advancement, now echoed like a courtroom. He stopped a few meters away. "Evelyn," he whispered, almost unable to find his voice. She turned slowly, her golden mask catching the light. Her gaze pierced him with a calculated coldness, a cruel elegance that was all her own. "Good evening, Richard," she replied in a calm, crystal-clear voice. What a surprise. A suspended silence. The music continued, but for them, the dance seemed frozen. Julian, unperturbed, offered a polite smile. He inclined his head slightly toward Richard, while keeping his hand resting with absolute control on the small of Evelyn's back. This simple gesture was worth 1,000 words. He wasn't running away, he wasn't hiding. On the contrary, he was demanding. Richard, his heart in his throat, felt a mixture of humiliation, rage, and incomprehension pass through him. The man he had welcomed into his circles, whom he considered almost a protege, stood there, arm in arm with his wife, like a quiet king. He turned his head slightly. His gaze met Samantha's, and again, he saw in her eyes something he had never expected, contempt. For Samantha, too, had just realized that she was only a minor piece in a larger chess game. Julian, the Julian she'd thought was hers in Richard's shadow, already belonged to Evelyn, and had for much longer. This wasn't a double betrayal. It was a show of strength. And in this theater of masks and sequins, the only man who hadn't seen anything coming was him. Richard, the man of unlimited power, stood there alone, unmasked. Later that evening, away from the hushed laughter and champagne, Evelyn Langford calmly led her husband to the balcony. Outside, the light Charleston breeze gently swayed the leaves of the magnolia trees. Lanterns hanging in the trees cast a golden glow on the stone paving. It was an intimate setting, almost too beautiful for the conversation they were about to have. Richard leaned against the wrought iron railing, his gaze shifty. Evelyn stood erect and poised, crossing her arms. She let a few seconds pass, long enough for the silence to weigh heavily. "How long?" she finally asked, her voice clear. He looked at her, surprised by the gentleness of her tone. It wasn't an explosion of anger. It was more dangerous. It was the calm of a woman who already knew everything. "Did you know?" She gave a mirthless smile. "Richard, I'm not an idiot. Samantha, she was so clumsy. Her perfume in your car, the withheld calls, and her lost looks when I saw her at our house. Did you think you could fool me without me noticing?" He didn't answer. The weight of shame crashed down on his shoulders. He, the man who thought he had everything under control, found himself exposed. He tried to regain the upper hand. "And Julian?" he asked through gritted teeth. "Are you sleeping with him to punish me?" Evelyn remained motionless. Her gaze, calm and clear, bored into his with icy intensity. "None." A silence. Then, calmly, "I fell in love with him." She let the words sink in, like a silent slap. "Unlike you, Julian listens to me. He respects me. He sees me. And he doesn't need to hide me." The words struck Richard with surgical precision. It wasn't the physical betrayal that devastated him. It was the naked truth. Evelyn no longer loved him. Perhaps she had never loved him as he had loved himself through her. He looked away, his jaw clenched. "I gave you everything," he murmured, almost plaintively. "No," she corrected. "You gave yourself through me. You loved me like a trophy, a name to flaunt, a perfect wife, but never a real woman." Richard felt a fear he had never known, the loss of what he could not buy, intimidate, or manipulate. Evelyn was no longer his. Perhaps she never had been. Meanwhile, inside the mansion, Julian Carter watched the scene from a large arched window, half hidden behind a velvet curtain. His face was impassive, but his thoughts were swirling. Everything had gone as planned. Or almost. He had studied Richard Langford's flaws for 2 years, infiltrated his dinner parties, charmed his partners, and sown seeds of discord where pride reigned. Samantha had been a gateway, naive, passionate, hungry for attention. Through her, he had obtained crucial information about Langford Capital's private investments. Evelyn, on the other hand, had been a whole different challenge. She wasn't just a conquest. She was a brilliant, formidable mind, a woman of principle. But beneath her self-possession hid an immense solitude. Julian had listened to her. He had taken his time. And without meaning to, or perhaps without trying to defend himself, he had let himself be caught up in the game. What none of his superiors in the rival company Knight and Harrow didn't know, it was that he hadn't planned to fall in love. He should have remained a strategist, keep his distance. But Evelyn had changed the game. And tonight, he had crossed a point of no return. On the balcony, Richard stared out over the gardens like a general looking at a lost battlefield. So what? Are you going to get a divorce? Give it to the press? Ruin everything? Evelyn sighed. Her gaze betrayed neither vengeance nor cruelty. There was a weariness, an old fatigue. I don't want to ruin anything. I'm not you. But I'm going to leave. And I'm going to take back what's mine, my life, my voice, and my choices. She stepped forward, past him. Then she stopped one last time, without looking back. And Richard, for the first time, you're no longer the center. You're no longer the axis around which everything revolves. When she disappeared into the shadows of the corridor, he was left alone. The champagne no longer sparkled. The music had slowed down. The king of the evening no longer had a queen, no throne, no game to control. A month after the Winter Gala, Charleston was engulfed in a media storm that would forever change the Langfords' destiny. The financial scandal erupted suddenly, like a bolt from the blue. Richard Langford, once a powerful financial magnate, was accused of large-scale market manipulation. The evidence seemed irrefutable: secret trading, pressure on brokers, false statements to investors. The media seized on the case voraciously, each headline amplifying the Titan's fall. Investors were fleeing, shareholders were losing confidence, and Langford Capital's stock price was plummeting. In the midst of this turmoil, Evelyn, strong and impassive, made a public statement that stunned Charleston's high society. She announced their divorce. She refused to remain the shadow of a man whose power had fallen, firmly asserting that she was taking control of her life, far from games and lies. I choose truth, justice, and freedom. This marriage is over. Samantha Greer, shattered by public humiliation, disappeared from the city's social circles. She left Charleston for Los Angeles, hoping to rebuild a life away from scandal and public scrutiny. Her beauty and charm opened a few doors, but the wounds of betrayal and oblivion followed her like a shadow. As for Julian Carter, he mysteriously disappeared. There was no trace of him in financial circles or at social gatherings. Officially, he had vanished, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions. But in the shadows, away from the spotlight and judgment, Julian found Evelyn again. In Florence, Italy, a city of art, renaissance, and secrets, she was waiting for him. In a cafe with patinated walls, to the sound of the cathedral bells, their eyes met. Far from the intrigues and Venetian masks, they were two wounded souls seeking peace. Evelyn had forgiven everything. Because, even though Julian had used her, even though he had been the catalyst for her fall and rebirth, he had also revealed to her an essential truth: her own strength. "You broke me, but you also set me free," she whispered. Julian, touched by this confession, understood that their story went far beyond power and manipulation. It was an unlikely encounter between two people seeking to rebuild their lives. For his part, Richard Langford now lived as a recluse in a remote Georgia villa, surrounded by pine trees and silent hills. The man who had once ruled the market was now a shadow of his former self. Without empire, without prestige, he found himself confronted with his own reflection, with the choices that had led to his ruin. His isolation was a self-imposed and bitter exile. His empire had collapsed, not because of a mere market reversal, but because of a man he himself had brought into his life, Julian Carter, the man who had manipulated him from within. At night, Richard watched the winter gala endlessly, the frozen smiles, the betrayed looks. That night where it all began, and everything changed. A year later, Charleston was back in its usual elegance. The winter gala was once again in full swing, with its masks, its whispers, and its promise of a perfect night. But this time, a rumor was circulating in the closed circles of high society. Evelyn Carter, Richard Langford's ex-wife, was reportedly back. And alongside her, there were whispers that a certain Julian Carter was now making waves as a global speaker on influence strategies, renowned in very different circles. Their return marked the end of one era and the beginning of another, where the rules had changed. As for Richard, in his remote villa, it was said that he was there, alone, sitting in front of his television, watching the images of the ball again and again, a prisoner of a past that he could not forget.